Tell us about that photo. Is there a story behind it? What sort of equipment did you use? Welcome to Through the Lens of Faith, 135 years of Courier photojournalism podcast, where we're getting the stories behind some of the photos that will be on display in a Catholic Courier photo exhibition this October. Now, here are your hosts, Gina Capilazzi and Rebecca LeClaire. Mike Latona has been on the staff at the Courier for 33 years, starting in 1991. Just 2 years after he started at the Courier, Mike traveled to Denver to cover World Youth Day. It was the first World Youth Day to be held in the United States, and more than 600,000 people, including Bishop Matthew Clark and other young people from the Diocese of Rochester, were in attendance to see Pope John Paul II.
Well, most of the photos on display in this exhibit actually come from Courier photographers, people who are hired to take pictures and photos. But Mike is a writer. But I can't wait to talk about this wonderful photo that just came about because of his trip. And Mike, why don't we start about talking about that? How did the trip come about and your participation in it?
Well, Rebecca, there was only one person on staff that would have been allowed to go out to Denver budgetarily. It just made more sense. So, I covered youth as part of my job responsibilities for the Courier. B, and this probably isn't very well known, but in my previous job, I worked for 8 years at Wolf Publications as a sports writer and photographer. So I had a substantial sports photography experience. So I knew how to use a camera. And between those two factors and the fact that I was single at the time and had the time to travel for a week, it all kind of fell into place.
Well, Mike, we know you have many, many talents, but most people know you by your byline for your articles. So when this photo opportunity came about, well, it was just basically a combination of your skills on this wonderful trip. Do you normally go out of state for these kind of trips a lot?
That was the first time I had gone out of state for anything Courier related, and I think, unless memory escapes me, it's still the only time. I've traveled out of state for newspaper conventions, but to actually cover an assignment, we usually stick within the 12 counties of the Diocese of Rochester, and it's once in a blue moon that any of us actually travel. So that was a very, very, very unique experience for me.
Now, Mike, I got to ask this question because I know you don't like to fly. So how did you get out to Denver for World Youth Day?
Train. I stayed overnight in Chicago. This was set up through a travel agency, and I got into Denver. I remember at about 11 in the morning on a Thursday, and I had quite a distance between the train station and the hotel I was staying at, and I was lugging all kinds of newspaper and camera equipment, and it was about 92 degrees. So, yes, I took the train.
But when you're preparing for this huge event and knowing that you're going to cover it for several days, lots of people you're going to be talking to, how do you prepare for an event, just equipment wise and also emotionally, to know that you can withstand all the pressure of basically covering something for 24 hours a day?
Right. They had an itinerary that they sent out. So I think it was a very, and one thing I probably will want to add in there, this was all by paper. It's hard for us to imagine not that many years later, but in 1993, there was still limited communication by computer. Nonetheless, World Youth Day did a very good job of sending out itineraries. And I was able to plan pretty well in that regard. Emotionally, you mentioned, I think there was, you rise to the occasion with any kind of job you cover as a journalist, but certainly this was something that was had no precedence. And the fact that I was doing both writing and photography, and there was an extreme amount of people, that's something that doesn't come up with this job too much. We might go to the cathedral and cover an ordination, and the cathedral is full, and that's about as big as the crowds ever usually get. And now I'm going to something with hundreds of thousands of people, and it was big time, and I don't feel anything I've done has been small time, but nonetheless, there had never been anything of this magnitude. I think it was more excitement than anything else. It was just an adrenaline rush because of the nature of the event. If it was just an assignment I had been put on and I was like, okay, I'll do it, it's my job, that would be different. But this had personal and professional connotations that were through the roof.
Now, when I went to NCYC and trying to navigate 20,000 youth, um, I was overwhelmed. How did you manage to get in touch with the people from the diocese? Because, as we said, Bishop Matthew Clark went on this trip, and there were also young people from our diocese. How were you able to connect with everyone once you got to Denver, and were able to tell their stories? Because 1991, there wasn't cell phone technology. You couldn't send a text and say, hey, can you meet up with me? There were so many people at this event. How did you connect with the diocese?
I mentioned getting into town on a Thursday morning, and that night was the first event that I had press credentials for, and it was at Mile High Stadium, and 80,000 people had that place filled. And I still remember now, as we asked the question, Mary Beth Mancini, who had been the longtime director of evangelization and catechesis here at the diocese. I just remember her looking around and looking around. And then when she saw me, she was like, here we go, and brought me to the group with the diocese. We must have had some sort of pre-arranged meeting place and time. Uh, and yet you think of all the things that could go wrong that would have botched it up. But I must have gone to the right spot at the right time, because there she was looking around. And when she saw me, she brought me to the diocesan group. There was probably a certain amount of cell phone availability at the time too. Maybe not texting yet, but I do recall that some people there. It wasn't like today where, if you don't know what Verizon or AT&T means, you've been living in a cave, right? There was still a certain amount of cell phone technology, and so I know I don't recall that I had a cell phone with me, but I think that process was helped along a little bit by at least a couple of people having cell phones.
And and perhaps a little divine intervention always helps a little bit. Now, I mentioned you were the only non-photographer from the Courier to be featured in this exhibit. So let's get in the mode of talking about the photo that's in the exhibit. It's fascinating to just analyze this. But for our listeners, would you mind first describing this photo so that we can feel what you saw?
Wow. It still gets to me. That was 31 years ago. It still gets to me. There were so many things that had to fall into place in order for that photo to occur. And this could be a rather lengthy answer, but it all started with the fact that I got into Denver a few hours late because of my train travel, and a dear friend of mine, Ann Sherman, whom I knew from working part-time at MCC, uh, was out there, and she had gotten independent credentials. She wrote for a Native American newspaper. She got credentialed for it. She knew I was coming, and I did not get into town in time to go to the gathering where you basically throw your name into a lottery to determine which events you would be allowed into and not. She knew I was coming, so she threw my name in. There were 4 events. One's not coming to me, but the other 3 were the final mass at Cherry Creek Park on Sunday, the gathering at Mile High Stadium that I was just talking about, and the Pope also had a meeting with President Clinton, who came out there. She threw my name in. I got 2 gigs. One was the Mile High. One was the day of the final mass. the closing mass at Cherry Creek Park with the hundreds of thousands of people. So that was number one, that I actually got credentialed. I got there to the park and had to be in place at about 4 o'clock in the morning. The mass didn't begin till I think 10 a.m. I came to realize after the mass began that I was in the front of a congregation of 600,000 people. And I eventually worked my way to the front row. And, 600,000 people. And I'm in the front for the Pope. And the Pope appeared, and I had a 500 millimeter lens that I borrowed from Gene Avalone, who was the owner of Park Ave Photo at the time. He was very nice to lend me that on my trip. So I had a nice piece of equipment with me. So all those things fell into place just that I even got in that position to begin with. That's what kind of led up to taking the photo. I'm not sure if you want me to go right now into how the photo emerged from there, but I certainly could.
Absolutely. And describing what we see in that beautiful picture, that would be great.
Okay, Rebecca. What I remember, it was the sign of peace, and there were several, maybe I'd say about 20 to 25 specially designated people who were allowed to go up one by one to be greeted with the sign of peace by the Pope. This was all happening, I'm probably going to say 100 yards away from me, which, if you consider the size of the venue, that's extremely close. Everybody was going up silently, and I was just snapping away. It was all very routine, if you will. I mean, it was a very special event, but nobody who was coming up said or did anything out of that was different from the other person, and neither did the Pope react any differently. It just was a bit of a, conveyor belt feeling. Then I heard a young woman crying audibly from where I was, loud and clear, and she waddled up there, going from side to side to side. It was very obvious she had some sort of a disability. And I can still see in my mind the Pope's expression changing from, I guess, what you would call general compassion to something deeper for her. His face really softened up. And everybody else who had gone up to the Pope shook his hand. When the Pope saw this young woman and how she was struggling to get up to him and how emotional she was, he didn't shake her hand. He just threw his arms around her, and they had a big hug. And that's when I snapped the shutter.
Did you, yeah, did you realize at the time what an incredible photo this was?
I had an inkling, and I say that because I saw the Pope's expression change through my lens so visibly. And I had an inkling, but you don't know if you have the perfect focus, right? You don't know if you shot right at that split second. He obviously didn't embrace her for 5 minutes. So that embrace realistically may have lasted 5 seconds. You just don't know until you get the film processed. This was before digital cameras, I should add. I was using regular black and white film, and you just don't know for sure if you had your settings on your camera correct. Kind of a scary feeling. So I was hoping, and I do think that when I got all the film developed back in Rochester, I was looking to see especially how that particular photo had turned out. So I would describe it as I had a feeling, but even then, when I did see the finished project, I think I just went, wow, this really happened. I think I was with my brother. He came with me to pick up the printed photos from, and we both just went, oh my goodness gracious, gracious.
I'm curious, did you ever have any further connection with the woman? We don't see her face. You've described what you saw leading up to that photo, but were you able to connect with her at all?
When the mass was over, I think it helped that she stood out so much. When I saw her the first time, there were people milling around the stage. The Pope had been taken away in his Pope copter, and he was long gone. So people were basically filing out. And I saw her from a little bit of a distance, and so I went up and got her name and talked to her a little bit. I think I used a quote or two from her in the article that I wrote. Her name was Kathleen Friel. She is from Houston, Texas. She confirmed to me that she had cerebral palsy and she was 19 years old. And I remember she signed my souvenir shirt that I was having people sign throughout the week, and she signed it the Pope Hugger. I'm guessing that I probably got her address and made sure that I sent her copies of the paper after it came out. And that would have been my last contact. But I was just telling Gina yesterday as I was looking back through my coverage, that I Googled Kathleen Friel's name, and she has gone on to become a well-known doctor who specializes in helping people with cerebral palsy. She'd be about 50 years old right now, and she's working in her practice is in Westchester County, so she's somewhere here in New York State. And I certainly have a mind, since contact information was put out there, to get a hold of her and let her know that we're doing this project. It'll be the first contact we've had in over 30 years.
Oh, that will be great if you can connect with her and tell her about this podcast. When you look at the photo today, what comes to your mind? What memories come back to you?
Just getting it in front of me here. I have a copy of it. It's genuine. It's real. You know what? This is a personal little soapbox thing, but I've never been a fan of reality shows because there's too much, as I call it, manufactured tears. Uh, Maybe the emotions are real, maybe they're not, but you have definitely producers wanting these people to show their emotions, and sometimes in a not so great way. I'm not so sure that on certain shows where the contestant loses or is kicked off the island or whatever you want to call it, and then they're crying about it, how much of that is crocodile tears. So that's just a little personal bias on my part. Uh, this was real. It's as real as you're going to get. And that's the part that stands out to me. It says, I realize that it's only one snapshot of a man who is now a saint, but I just think when you think of all the other things that have been said about St. John Paul II, nobody should be surprised that a photo like this existed. I think it captures him at his best. And when I think of all the love that was pouring out for him when people saw him that week, uh, it all fits. It's as real as you're going to get. And I did have the privilege of seeing the front of Kathleen's face. You only see the hairdo, and she was just lovely too. It was. I guess even if the photo hadn't turned out well, the moment itself was so powerful. And so that's what I think about. As I said, I can still hear her crying as she went up to see him.
You are so blessed, Mike, to have these experiences as part of your job. And I know that you were at another World Youth Day with Pope John Paul. It was his last one that he attended in Toronto. But would there be any other pictures or photos that you took that could be as memorable as this one? Was there anything else about that experience that you want to relay in this podcast?
Yeah, that obviously that photo was the pinnacle of the week and a memory that will last forever. But so many other things happened during the week. Um, Bishop Clark there was 600 people from the diocese, young people, uh, sleeping on the ground at Cherry Creek Park the night before the final mass, uh, going to Mile High Stadium and seeing him appear for the first time. That was probably, I don't know whether it was shocking's the wrong word, but it was just so profound to actually see a pope with my own eyes for the first time ever, not on television, but with my very own eyes. That was at Mile High Stadium. Uh, so that was memorable. Talking to people all week, just we're here, can you believe it? All the other journalists were so excited. The only one that seemed just a little jaded, and I just think this is so funny, but at the press hotel, they had a big press room area for the working journalists. And as I was wandering through there, I came across Carl Bernstein, the same Carl Bernstein who co-wrote All the President's Men with Bob Woodward. And I went up to him, had him sign my souvenir shirt, and asked him what he was doing there. And he said, well, I'm writing a book about the Pope. And I was like, can you tell me more about the Pope? And he was kind of guarded about it. I think he said, well, it's still kind of in development. And I said, well, what kind of aspects are you digging into? And I thought about it later. I'm grilling Carl Bernstein, uh, who is famous for grilling people. And I thought, boy, I'm glad it wasn't in a mean way, but I was like, he could have said, hey, stop asking me all these questions. I ask the questions around here. So that came to me. And then I was going down the elevator and I was speaking to a clergyman who was all dressed up. And I said, yeah, I'm from Rochester, New York. And he said, well, I'm from Boston. And I go, are you a priest there? He goes, well, I'm the cardinal. It was cardinal law. And we were the only two on the elevator. So those kinds of things happen this week. I'm not a big celebrity worshiper, but I did get a kick out of those things happening. It just, again, it speaks to the magnitude of the event. But that's the big shot stuff. I think I don't want, us common folks. We were mostly, journalists and pilgrims from all over the world who sacrificed a lot to be there. And I don't include myself as the sacrifice part, but the pilgrims who went there, sleeping in the park. The final mass was about 96 degrees and people were passing out all over the place. You can't possibly have a well-controlled event with hundreds of thousands of people when the weather gets that hot. I mean, you can control it as well as you can, but there are just certain things that you're not going to be able to deal with because of the weather. So I think of the sacrifice of time and comfort that people made to be there all week because this was that important to them. I think of the 600 people from our diocese and the immense fire they were on that came back and really permeated youth ministry throughout the diocese for years and years after that. Youth groups were not necessarily a common thing at parishes in the early 1990s, but that experience in Denver was really a galvanizing event for youth ministry in the Diocese of Rochester. And Bishop Clark should and did get a lot of credit for not just supporting what was happening, but being an active participant right down to sleeping in the park the night before with the kids.
Well, Mike, I knew a little bit about this photo from working with you for the past 10 years, but I just learned a whole lot more. So thank you for taking time to talk with Rebecca and I about this photo. You can see Mike's photos and the Courier photographer's photos in an exhibit this October. For more information, visit our website, catholiccourier.com/lensoffaith.